Given that 8 minutes is inadequate time for sufficient depth into a debate such as this, I have chosen to give my brief formal speech for the purposes of this course, followed by an epilogue going into greater depth and answering a question that I promised to answer. So please enjoy the speech and enjoy the epilogue if you so choose. All advanced civilizations pass through a period of enlightenment. Some even survive it. Thomas Fleming. I start with this quote about the Enlightenment because it is precisely in the Enlightenment and the changes in thinking that it brought that are the foundations of our debate between capitalism and socialism. And these assumptions have gone unexamined because they are simply accepted as dogmatic truth. Today, we are going to look at how one of those assumptions in particular functions in capitalism, why socialism fails as a solution to that problem, and how distributism is the path toward real economic freedom. I think both sides can agree that there are problems in the world today that need to be addressed. And I think we can all agree that we want real economic freedom and prosperity for as many people as possible. We just disagree about how to get there. So, about me, I am not ashamed to say that I am a Catholic. It is my Catholic faith that informs my worldview, especially on this topic. So in order to accomplish our goal, first we're going to go into capitalism, then we will go into the socialist proposal, followed by distributism and its examples. First, capitalism. The capitalist narrative says that because it is a free market system, it has brought unprecedented wealth and prosperity. And to a certain extent, this is true. The world has a lot more wealth than it did before capitalism came into being. But is it a really, truly free market system? First, we need to define what a free market is, and even before that, what freedom is. It was John Locke in his second treatise on government who first formally redefined freedom as the mere absence of restraint. So what does this look like in free market capitalism? This means that a free market is a market free from government interference. How does this look like in practice? Let's take the game of Monopoly, which we are all familiar with, a game that was created to teach kids capitalism. We all know how the game ends. It ends when one person owns all of the properties on the board and all of the other players are bankrupt. That is pure capitalism. So let that sink in. There is no getting around it. And the proponents of socialism rightly point out this fundamental problem. G.K. Chesterton put it this way: capitalism is contradictory as soon as it is complete, because it is dealing with the mass of men in two opposite ways at once. When most men are wage earners, it is more and more difficult for most men to be customers. The capitalist wants the same man to be rich and poor at the same time. So what about the socialist proposal? Socialists say that let's take all of that wealth, all of that capital, and place it in the hands of government politicians. And this sounds like a good idea because, after all, aren't our politicians supposed to be our servants and act in our best interests? Hilaire Belloc pointed out two problems with this. First, the majority of people desire at least some level of independence. Also, politics is a dirty business, and many gain political office by less than honest means. So socialism means that all of a sudden, these corrupt politicians are supposed to become selfless and virtuous in dealing with the economy. And that simply doesn't happen. In fact, where socialism has been put into practice, we see this mass corruption. The Wall Street Journal noted that well over 100 million people have died under socialist regimes. And that doesn't include those who have died in wars related to socialism. So if socialism, all it does is transfer power from a few corporate elites to corrupt politicians. So it doesn't change the power structure that is really the problem. The solution is what is called distributism. Distributism is based on Catholic social teaching, and it revolves around three principles: the just wage, subsidiarity, and solidarity. The just wage simply means that a man earns enough to support himself and his family in their necessities, have a little bit left over for small luxuries, as well as savings. Subsidiarity means all decisions are made at the lowest practical level. Solidarity means that all decisions take into account others, that we are not just making decisions for ourselves, that we recognize all of our decisions affect other people. There are actually examples of distributism very close to home. Winco is an employee-owned company. Idaho Central Credit Union is member-owned. CapEd Credit Union also is member-owned. Let's take a recent example of solidarity in action from Idaho Central Credit Union. With the government shutdown, and when these workers missed their paychecks, Idaho Central Credit Union stepped in and said, we are going to issue all those affected workers $5,000 interest-free loans against future paychecks, regardless of membership. That is solidarity in action. Can you imagine Bank of America, or US Bank, or Wells Fargo stepping in to do this very same thing? No, they would not, because they are not small enough and they are not member-owned. They have no solidarity, just business interests. Now that we have looked through capitalism, its problems, socialism, and how it fails as a solution, and how distributism is the way toward real economic freedom, I would like you to write down one thing that you can do to bring distributism into action. All advanced civilizations pass through a period of enlightenment. Some even survive it. We have the power to be able to not only survive, but to thrive. Now for the epilogue. So first, let us go back. Basically, let's just follow the same format that I did in the speech, but go into a little bit more depth. And as promised, I will answer a question specifically on how distributism applies to education and one of the problems with our public education system today. So first, capitalism and some of its problems. Capitalism, like I said, tends to be a free market system. Pretends to be a free market system when in fact it is not. Again, the definition, the assumed definition, is the absence of restraint, particularly the absence of government restraint. Yet this definition of freedom doesn't work in practice, and it doesn't correspond to reality in our actual experience. Take for example, the alcoholic. Is an alcoholic free? Well, when he's drinking, no, he's a slave to drink. Is the recovering alcoholic free? Yeah, absolutely he is, because he is following a program of recovery, following a program of self-discipline. Again, there are choices that we can make that are truly bad for us. Going to the example of drink, how many of us have had a few too many on a Friday or Saturday night only to wake up the next morning with a hangover? I certainly have before, and it's not fun. So there are free decisions that we can make that are bad for us. And we are better off when we are self-disciplined, when we get enough sleep, when we eat right. And that goes back to the traditional definition of freedom as living the good life, a life of morality and virtue. And that is precisely what is lacking in capitalist philosophy. It was Bernard Mandeville who even went so far as to say the flourishing of vice leads to the greatest economic good. So this, if we are to follow the logical consequences of that, we shouldn't have any borders. We should allow sex trafficking. But most of us, I think, when we're honest with ourselves, we recognize human dignity, and we don't want to allow that. But yet, that is the fundamentals of free market capitalism. Now, let's go into socialism a little bit. The proponents of free market capitalism, criticizing socialism, will say that socialism destroys creativity, it destroys capital, and it destroys wealth, and they're absolutely right. Because we've seen it everywhere it's been fully put into practice. Let's take Venezuela, for example. There is mass violence, there is a lot of death, there is starvation. They lack basic medical supplies that we have in this country, or even countries such as Canada, which are quasi-socialist. And again, socialism, communism, it gets to be where you're considered wealthy if you have a roll of toilet paper. And which goes into another problem with capitalism versus socialism, is the debate between individualism or collectivism. Individualism capitalist philosophy starts with the individual, the autonomous individual, and absolute autonomy. Yet again, this doesn't correspond to our real experience. We are born in relationship. We have relationships to our parents, and we get our identities through relationship with each other. And there is no such thing as a purely individual choice. We are all influenced by our upbringings, the culture we live in, our family, our friends. And again, our culture and the narratives we receive are inherited. We don't choose which narratives we hear growing up. At a certain point, we can choose to accept them or reject them based on thinking it through, viewing opposing sides, and the like. But collectivism ignores the individual and says we're purely social. And so it becomes, and that's where socialism, communism becomes a purely state system. And so as long as the state, the government, is doing okay, it doesn't matter how the individual citizens are doing. Because it's the state, it's the country. Both are only half of the equation. We are both individual and social. And that is part of Catholic tradition. That's part of really the synthesis between the Christian narrative and Greek philosophy. And that was the foundation for 2 millennia until the Enlightenment systematically overturned that. And that is where distributism comes in. So distributism, again, starts with the just wage. And I think those proponents of capitalism listening to me, free market capitalism, oppose the just wage on saying, it's like, well, but we can't require too much of a wage that a firm will go bankrupt. And that is absolutely right, because that is part of just wage theory. On the one hand, there is, at the very basis, subsistence wages. The problem is, under pure capitalism, without any law or values to put on subsistence to where a man can support himself and his family, you have starvation wages. And that's exactly what we had in both England and in America until the collapse of capitalism in the US with the Great Depression. Take, for example, the slums in Glasgow in the 19th century. Glasgow was an expanding economy. Even among the poorest of the poor, wages were rising. And yet, in the slums, when a government official visited, they were both dirty and filthy on the outside, and even worse on the inside. There were, in his own description, there were 15 to 20 people to a room, some naked, barely any furniture, and the only semblance of a home was a fire in the hearth. So you can't say that pure capitalism is a good system. Again, to point out another example, if capitalism were so great, pure capitalism were so great, why would so many factory workers feel the need to sabotage their own workstations? And yet that's precisely what happened. And then you had the riots and the unionizations. So if capitalism is so great, why the rise of the unions? Here's another thing. As John Mackay points out in Toward a Truly Free Market, from 1900 until 1945, the U.S. economy was in recession or depression of fully 40% of the time. From 1950 until 2009, a couple of years before he wrote this book, it was in recession 15% of the time. So what changed? What changed was precisely government intervention, the New Deal, and government stepping in to make up for the inefficiencies of capitalism. Because again, going back to G.K. Chesterton's quote, wanting the same man to be rich and poor at the same time, this is the problem with too large of a wage gap. Is that when purchasing power is insufficiently distributed, the market can't clear, and you have to have government step in to make up for the difference between supply and demand. So again, you have the rise of government spending, consumer credit, and the welfare state. And yet, even under Republican governments, the federal government and the debt has expanded. Just take, as of this recording, yesterday, it was announced that President Trump has made a deal with the Democrat leadership for $2 trillion in infrastructure spending. And yet, the national debt is $22 trillion. So that's a problem when the government debt is that large. This system, this state of things is increasingly unstable, and that's another thing of the problem with capitalism. Even Karl Marx accepted capitalism as a necessary phase on the road to socialism. So capitalism ends with socialism. So how do we prevent that? Again, distributism. subsidiarity, and solidarity. Another part of that is widespread ownership, private property. And this can't specifically be done primarily through government action. I mean, government action can help, government legislation can certainly help, but it has to be a culture change. It has to be, as Hilaire Belloc pointed out, a return to the desire for ownership. And so that's how these employee, family-owned companies, farms, are doing much better, produce much better quality products than some of these larger manufacturers. Why is that? Because when we own things ourselves, we take better care of it. We have more interest in it. Solidarity. Solidarity, another way of putting solidarity is just thinking of the common good, which is what is lost and not taken into account in capitalism, in purely absolute autonomous individual capitalism. And neither is it in socialism. At least on the surface it is. But in practice, it's not. Because again, like we pointed out, so many have died under socialism because of the corrupt politicians who propose it and take power. Again, what does this mean? Again, so we are individuals in relationship. We each have dignity. Our decisions affect everyone else. And so when we are working for the common good, then the economy does better, everyone does better. I mean, it's not a perfect system, but neither is it to either extreme of capitalism or socialism. So now to the question that I promised to answer. Distributism in terms of public education and its problems. So again, because it is a problem of the power structure, the public education system and the unions, the problem with unions in general, while they may start out for the interests of workers and the common good, and indeed the Catholic recognizes the right for workers to form associations. But what the church has in mind is something more akin to the guild system of the Middle Ages, which was, critics will say, it was chartered monopolies, but it was more than just, material enterprises. They were spiritual enterprises as well, because it was the Catholic Church that was the conscience of it. They came together, they set prices, they set standards, and so really, at least the only guild I can think of that we actually have in America is the Brewers Guild. And they come together and do the very same thing. But unions, it's a power struggle. It's a power struggle between the union and the employers. So it violates subsidiarity, and that it's the union bosses that make all the decisions, supposedly on behalf of the union members. But again, that violates solidarity, because the joint decisions aren't between the union bosses and the employers, because it's just a clash of wills. So that violates solidarity, and it violates subsidiarity, because the teachers, the workers, don't really have much of a say in what goes on with the union bosses. And again, that's a problem with our public education system, is teachers don't really have a lot of say in what goes on in their classrooms, at least in traditional public schools. And and my wife is a teacher, and one of the problems again is we have these standardized tests, and yes, I mean we should have a standard for the quality of education and the quality of our students and our learning and our knowledge, and more than just knowledge, how being able to be well-rounded individuals who can think and speak clearly and coherently and know how to arrive at truth. But when the state comes in and with federal mandates for that, teachers and schools are left without the necessary control to address their local needs. Because the local needs are very different here in Laredo, Texas, where I'm speaking to you from, than they are in Boise, Idaho, where you are listening to me from, or anyone else who might be watching. It's different in Portland, Oregon versus, New York versus Chicago versus, any a small rural community. And that's where the public education system fails in subsidiarity and solidarity. So hopefully I went into sufficient detail here. Hopefully I was clear enough. Just briefly, I will show you my primary sources of where I've gotten this knowledge about distributism, the arguments against both capitalism and socialism, and just generally how I've come to the conclusions that I have, and continue to reread and relearn and go into more depth, because I'm not a complete expert, and I'm just sharing with you what I've learned and what little knowledge I have on the subject. So to go through that, Toward a Truly Free Market is the first book I read. I will be providing a link to his Google Presents talk. More recently, but he published this book earlier, The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace. Again, Hilaire Belloc, Economics for Helen. It was a very good basic introduction. I highly recommend it. He wrote back in the early 20th century and actually predicted what we have today in his book called The Servile State. And the quote from G.K. Chesterton I got from The Outline of Sanity. So again, I encourage you to maybe look that up. Watch John Madai's Google Presents talk that goes into a little bit more depth. Specifically, it's presenting specific arguments from Toward a Truly Free Market and other aspects, such as labor, land, capital, what money is, as results as distributism applies to taxes, healthcare, etc. So with that, I hope this was sufficient, and enjoy the rest of your time. Thank you.